There are moments in a mother's life that language simply isn't built for. Not the everyday moments, the scraped knees, the school plays, the proud graduations. No, the moments I'm talking about are the ones that ambush you. The ones where you're standing in a perfectly ordinary room, surrounded by perfectly ordinary noise, and then something happens that splits your life into a clean before and after. For Terri Irwin, one of those moments came when she looked across a crowded room and saw the man her son had become. And what happened next? The tears, the quiet collapse of 2 decades of held-together strength, tells you everything you need to know about a family that has quietly carried one of the greatest losses in modern public life, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, come out the other side. To understand where Robert Irwin is today, you have to go back to the beginning of the hardest chapter, September 4th, 2006. It was a Monday morning in Queensland when the news began to travel, slowly at first, and then all at once, the way terrible news always does. Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, the man who had made an entire generation fall in love with wildlife simply by loving it so loudly himself, was gone. A stingray barb, a freak accident in the shallow waters near Bat Reef. He was 44 years old. The world grieved publicly and extravagantly. Flowers were left at the gates of Australia Zoo. Tributes poured in from world leaders, from Hollywood, from conservationists on every continent. Television networks ran special programming for days. Millions of people who had never met Steve Irwin felt the specific, strange grief of losing someone whose joy had been part of the furniture of their lives. But for Terri Irwin, the grief wasn't a television segment. It was the empty chair at the dinner table. It was the sound of her daughter Bindi, 8 years old, trying very hard to be brave. It was Robert, just 2 years old, too small to understand the word gone, too young to have a single clear memory that he could hold on to in the years to come. Terri was 42. She was in a foreign country. She was suddenly a single mother to 2 young children. She was the new custodian of a sprawling wildlife park that employed hundreds of people and depended on the Irwin name to survive. And the whole world was watching to see what she would do next. What she did was stay. That decision, quiet, unglamorous, and almost incomprehensibly difficult, is the foundation on which everything that follows is built. She didn't retreat to her home state of Oregon. She didn't sell the zoo, take the money, and disappear into a life where nobody would recognize her in the supermarket. She looked at Australia Zoo, at the animals Steve had loved, at the staff who had built their livelihoods around that place, and she decided that the dream was still worth protecting. Then she put her head down, and she got to work. For years, the public got occasional glimpses of Terri in this mode: calm, measured, professional, always holding it together in press interviews and zoo appearances. What the public didn't see was the reality behind that composure. The financial pressures of running a major wildlife park without its most famous face, the legal complexities that come with managing a significant estate and global licensing agreements, the constant low-grade vigilance of shielding 2 children from a media that was perpetually hungry for a "how are the Irwin kids coping" story. She was doing all of this at once, every day, with nobody at home to share the load at the end of it. Robert Irwin was not given the luxury of a quiet childhood. The moment he was old enough to appear in public, the comparisons began. Same blonde hair, same wide-open face, same instinctive ease around animals. People loved it, and people were relentless about it. Every zoo appearance, every early television segment, every photograph produced another wave of commentary about how much he looked like his father, how he moved like his father, how he even laughed like his father. For a child, that kind of comparison is complicated territory. On one hand, there is something beautiful and comforting about being told you carry someone beloved inside you. On the other hand, it creates a pressure that most adults would find crushing: the pressure to be a sequel, to honor a legacy that is already written, to perform a version of a person you never really got to know. Robert has spoken openly in interviews about the fact that his relationship with his father exists almost entirely through archived footage. While other children learn who their fathers are through 10,000 ordinary interactions, breakfast conversations, car rides, arguments about homework, Robert learned who Steve was by watching television. He studied his father's voice, his mannerisms, his particular way of approaching a saltwater crocodile through the same screen that millions of strangers did. The intimacy was real, but it was also mediated, filtered, curated. Terri understood this tension better than anyone. She was careful, over the years, never to tell Robert who he should be. She didn't push him toward replicating his father's television persona. She didn't insist on khaki shorts and high-energy performance. Instead, she did something more subtle and more valuable. She kept Steve's values alive in the house: the reverence for animals, the commitment to conservation, the belief that the natural world deserves our full attention, while giving Robert the freedom to find his own way into those values. She watched, and she waited. Robert Irwin found photography in his early teens, and photography found him right back. He picked up a camera with the kind of immediate, instinctive affinity that suggests this was always going to happen. And what he discovered behind that lens was something that no amount of TV coaching could have given him: a voice that was entirely his own. Think about what photography required of him, in contrast to everything the public expected. The public expected noise, energy, movement, the physical confrontation with danger that had made his father famous. Photography required the exact opposite. It required stillness, patience, the ability to disappear into a landscape and wait for hours, sometimes days, for the right light, the right moment, the right creature to present itself. Where Steve had charged toward the action, Robert learned to become invisible to it, and what he captured in that stillness was extraordinary. His wildlife images taken across Australia, and eventually across the globe, from the Galapagos to the Arctic, began winning serious recognition. He was not being celebrated as a famous man's son who dabbled in cameras. He was being celebrated as a legitimate wildlife photographer with a distinctive eye and genuine technical mastery. The Natural History Museum's Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition, one of the most respected in the field, recognized his work. He was building a credential that had nothing to do with his last name and everything to do with what he could see. For Terri, watching this happen was quietly transformative. She had spent years worrying with a mother's particular low-level, never quite gone anxiety about whether Robert would be able to carve out an identity that felt genuinely his. The photography answered that question. Here was something he had claimed entirely for himself. Here was proof that the Irwin engine, that specific restless hunger to engage with the natural world, had not skipped a generation, but had found a new direction to run in. The photography was the foundation. What happened next was the house built on top of it. As Robert moved through his late teens and into his early 20s, the world began to notice that something was shifting. The quiet kid with the camera was becoming something else. He was stepping into public life with a confidence and a charisma that felt earned rather than inherited. He had done the internal work. He had figured out through long hours of solitude in wildlife hides and editing suites who he was and what he stood for. And now, gradually, he was bringing that person out into the open. Television came calling, and this time, it was on his own terms. When he was announced as a co-host on a major Australian primetime program, a lot of people in the industry were watching to see how he would handle it. Could the son of a larger-than-life television icon carry a prime-time slot on his own merit? The answer, delivered week after week, was an unambiguous yes. He was warm, but grounded. He had his father's gift for making people feel genuinely delighted to be in the same room as him, but he delivered it in a register that was distinctly modern, self-aware, thoughtful, and with a dry wit that was entirely his own construction. His public profile continued to grow in ways that surprised even those who had been watching him closely. Brand partnerships with major Australian and international companies positioned him not just as a conservation spokesperson, which would have been the safe, expected path, but as a genuine cultural figure, someone whose presence meant something to a generation that had grown up in the era of social media and environmental anxiety. He became, for a large and genuinely moved audience, a kind of proof of concept that it was possible to care deeply about the planet, to do real and meaningful conservation work, and to also be, by any measure, a person who had figured out how to live well. He won a Mirrorball trophy on Dancing with the Stars. He was courted by major U.S. networks. His face appeared at Madame Tussauds. He met royalty. He kept flying back to Queensland to help care for the animals at Australia Zoo. None of it seemed to shake him, and that steadiness, more than any individual achievement, was the thing that told the full story of what Terri had built. Which brings us back to the room. Terri Irwin has attended hundreds of formal events in the 20 years since losing Steve. Galas, benefit dinners, conservation award nights, film premieres. She has walked into every one of them as the composed, reliable, capable woman she had to become. She has shaken hands, given speeches, accepted plaques, posed for photographs, and gone home to the zoo. She is good at it. She has had to be. But on this particular night, something different happened. The room was full of the kind of people who don't usually get surprised. Industry figures, media personalities, philanthropists, the sort of crowd where everybody is used to being the most important person at any given table. And then Robert Irwin walked in. It was not just the way he looked, though the way he looked was striking. He had grown into himself completely. The slightly uncertain teenager, the earnest young conservationist, the kid people kept referencing his father's name around, all of that was gone. The man who entered the room had a presence that was self-generated and fully formed. People turned. Conversations paused. The room rearranged itself slightly around the fact of his arrival. Terri saw it happen, and something inside her gave way. She has described in subsequent interviews a feeling that she can only call being caught off guard by her own emotions. She was not expecting to cry. She is not, by her own account, someone who cries easily in public. But there was something about that particular moment, about seeing Robert command that particular room with that particular ease, that bypassed every defense she had spent 20 years constructing. She was not crying for Steve, though the awareness of his absence is never entirely gone. She was not crying from sadness at all, in any simple sense of the word. She was crying because the thing she had been working toward for 2 decades, the thing she had traded her own social life, her own romantic life, her own rest and ease and personal comfort, for was standing right there in front of her in a tailored jacket, utterly at home in the world. She had raised a man who was not broken. That is the sentence that matters. After everything, the public tragedy, the financial stress, the grinding relentlessness of single parenthood in the full glare of global attention, the quiet private moments when she must have wondered if she was doing any of it right. The evidence was standing across the room, shaking hands with strangers, laughing at something someone had said, radiating the specific confidence of a person who knows exactly who they are. It would be easy, and it would be wrong to tell this story as if Robert Irwin's transformation happened to Terri, as if she were simply a spectator at the unveiling of something miraculous. The truth is considerably more complicated and considerably more earned than that. Terri Irwin is the reason any of this happened. Not in the soft, sentimental sense that all mothers shape their children, though that is also true, but in the very specific, very concrete sense that the decision she made, year after year, in the face of genuine difficulty and genuine uncertainty, created the conditions in which Robert could become who he is. She kept the zoo alive when it would have been easier to let it go. She kept Steve's conservation mission at the center of family life when she could have allowed it to quietly fade. She gave Robert permission to be a photographer, a quiet observer, an artist, rather than insisting he performed the louder version of the Irwin legacy that would have been more commercially obvious. She shielded him, with fierce and tireless attention, from the narrative that the tabloid press was always eager to write the tragic orphan, the child star burning out, the son who couldn't live up to his father. None of those stories were written, because she refused to let them be written. not with press releases or legal threats, but with the steady, daily grinding work of raising a grounded child in ungrounded circumstances. What does it mean for a legacy to be transformed rather than simply continued? Steve Irwin's legacy, as it existed at the time of his death, was a specific thing: a high-energy, physically courageous, loudly enthusiastic engagement with wildlife that had electrified television audiences around the world for over a decade. It was a magnificent legacy. It was also, in some ways, a very particular one built around Steve's specific personality, his specific body, his specific and unrepeatable way of inhabiting a moment. Robert has not continued that legacy in the sense of replicating it. He could not have done so, even if he had wanted to. You cannot replicate the unrepeatable. What he has done instead is something more interesting and, arguably, more durable. He has taken the values at the core of his father's work, the belief that wild animals deserve our protection and our wonder, that conservation is not a hobby, but an urgent moral responsibility, that connecting people to the natural world is one of the most important things a person can do with a public platform, and he has carried them forward in a form that is entirely his own and entirely of his time. He has reached audiences his father never could have reached, using tools and platforms that didn't exist when Steve was alive. He has shown that environmental advocacy can coexist with fashion campaigns and primetime television and social media virality, that caring about the planet does not require you to look or sound or behave in any particular prescribed way. He has made the Irwin mission feel alive and relevant and modern in a way that genuine continuation, rather than mere replication, always does. There is a particular kind of pride that only parents know. It is not the uncomplicated pride of watching your child win a prize or ace a test. It is deeper and stranger than that. It is the pride of recognizing, in the person standing in front of you, the accumulated effect of every hard choice you made when the right choice wasn't obvious, every sacrifice you made when sacrifice felt almost more than you could manage, every morning you got up and kept going when going felt impossible. Terri Irwin's tears in that room on that night were that kind of pride. They were for the 2-year-old who never got to know his father and had to learn to carry that absence without being crushed by it. They were for the teenager who had to figure out how to have an identity in the shadow of a legend. They were for every early morning and